Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on the future of education. I am Anna Gawel. I'm managing editor of the Washington Diplomat. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Hold on one second. There we go. I was hearing an echo. So, as I was saying, welcome to the panel on the future of education, which is quite in and of itself a enormous loaded title for a panel. And now you have this equally enormous asterisk of the future of education during and after a global pandemic. So, which of course is a whole different ballgame. We'll be talking, of course, a lot about the pandemic. You know, from my perspective, the pandemic has sped up two of the most critical issues in education, both, I think, for better and for worse. One, of course, is this transition to virtual learning, which we're all getting a crash course in right now, and have been discovering both its benefits and its challenges. And second, by extension, the pandemic has really exposed and exacerbated the deeply rooted inequalities that have long existed in the education system. So on top of all this, we happen to have a slight political change coming up in the weeks ahead. So of course, that will also bring seismic changes to the political landscape, and specifically policies such as immigration that, of course, are inextricably linked to international educational exchange. So we have a lot to unpack, and so let's start with a brief introduction of our panelists. We have Dr. William Brustein, who is advisor to the president for global affairs at West Virginia University. Hi, William.
Oh, hi.
So through Professor Brustein's leadership, WVU has earned the Institute of International Education's prestigious High Scale Award, honoring the university's innovative international partnership with the Royal University for Women in Bahrain in 2018. And speaking of the Institute of International Education, we have Dr. Allan Goodman, who is president of IIE. Hi, Allan.
Hi, nice to be with you.
Hi. So IIE actually marked its centennial last year, and among other things, it promotes the exchange of scholars and students. And before joining IIE, Dr. Goodman was executive dean of the Georgetown University of Foreign Service, and he's also served at the State Department and the CIA, and is a founding member of the World Innovation Summit for Education. And then we also have Jennie Magiera, who is the Global Head of Education Impact for Google. Hi, Jennie. So she is also the author of Courageous Adventures, and president of the nonprofit Our Voice Alliance, whose mission is to elevate marginalized voices and improve equity and empathy in education. She's also a former Chicago public schools teacher. So when it comes to education, she has really been in the trenches, I would say. So thank you everyone for joining us. Allan, I'd like to start with you. I know it's difficult to gauge the impact that COVID-19 has had on international enrollment and study abroad programs, since we're still very much in the midst of this crisis. And we'll be talking in a bit to with your colleague about some of the statistics that IIE has gathered so far. But what are some of your general observations, both on how the pandemic has created barriers to international student exchange, and on the flip side, how it's potentially opened the possibility of more collaboration because of this dramatic expansion in distance virtual learning?
Well, nobody knows when this pandemic is going to end, but we do know that most pandemics are conquered by either how we treat people ill from the pandemic or through vaccines. This is IIE's 12th pandemic. And what I know for sure is that after this is over, William and I are going to be busier than ever, because after every pandemic, when it ends, when it's safe to travel, international student exchange resumes. It's one of the first industries or activities to resume, and it almost always increases. And every indication we have is that there is and will be a lot of pent-up demand for the exchanges that we value. And we'll come out of this with a lot of silver linings. We will have a playbook for how to be prepared for the next pandemic. We know that we can pivot quickly to a variety of learning platforms if we have to. And we're hearing that even more important will be the quality of the student experience when people return to campus, return to travel, return to exchanges. So it will make what we're doing even more important, and we'll be able to do it in an environment where geography, time, and space may not be quite as big a set of barriers as they were before.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, so William, let me throw it over to you. I mean, similar question. What have you seen over, almost the last year in terms of international enrollment and exchange at WVU? But also, more broadly, what are your thoughts on the long-term impact of the pandemic, both, positive and negative?
Right. Well, Hannah, thank you. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with distinguished speakers. I think, well, with respect to West Virginia University, a number of our international students, a few hundred of them, decided not to go back home, back overseas, and they stayed on campus starting in March. And that for them, they have been able to continue their coursework both mostly in a hybrid form. Some of the classes have been online while they've been in Morgantown, others have been in person. But for those overseas, we've had to move to virtual platforms. And yes, there were some hiccups in the beginning and complaints in terms of from the students as well as from faculty members. But we've been able to maintain that, and we've been able to tweak these virtual platforms and seen some improvement. Now, one thing that needs to be pointed out, and this is particularly the case for a university like West Virginia University, which is a state university, so part of its funding comes from the state of West Virginia. And with COVID-19, what has happened is that monies and funding that we would have hoped for, we haven't received them in the amounts that we would have expected. And as we look into the future, we're really concerned about these revenue streams. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing on the campus now is an effort to really think about what is mission central, mission critical for the university. And at the same time, this has led to cutting back on certain programs. And what we need to do in terms of the international space is to make sure that what we make the case in a value added sense to the university, to the community, that they should invest in our programs to enable us to continue to provide the kind of education, both the students who are our domestic students as well as international students. Mm-hmm. But as we go on in this conversation, I would love the opportunity to talk about what I see on the horizon in terms of major challenges and hurdles to our hopes of maintaining and building these international student streams. Mm-hmm.
Now, a quick question just to follow up before we get to that topic. You touched on something that is so critical, which is the issue of tuition affordability. You have this, incredible dilemma of schools, especially as you said, state schools, that are running into financial hardships, in part because so many students are running into financial hardships. They're deferring, and many students are wondering, why should I pay full tuition if I'm, taking an online course? And whereas, many universities are not financially in the position to cut tuition rates. So, you'd mentioned this problem at your university. I mean, can you give us some thoughts on how you're attempting to tackle it?
Right. What we're trying to do for our domestic students is to make sure whatever funding that we have, we can continue to use scholarships, fellowships to help reduce the costs. At the same time, we have reimbursed students during the past 9 months for their housing. We have not reduced tuition rates. The reason why is because we are very much tuition dependent, and the cost of moving to these new platforms and at the same time on campus being able to have a safe classroom experience costs a lot of money. And so that has been one challenge that is an issue, in not being able to reduce tuition. Now, with respect to international students, what we did before the pandemic was that for students who were part of our articulated agreements, these dual degree programs that we had, let's say with students in China, we were able to cut tuition for those students by 1/3. And again, because keeping in mind that domestic students being out of state university pay something like 1/3 of what out of state international students. So we have found ways to reduce that cost, but it is going to continue to be a major challenge because we have to keep this type of format that we have to provide the quality education. It requires money, resources, and being tuition dependent. And we're not alone. Many schools and public universities particularly are in the same
right
boat.
No, and that's definitely an issue we're going to be exploring throughout today and tomorrow as well, because it's a long-standing issue, and again, one that's been really exacerbated by the pandemic. So Jennie, I wanted to turn it over to you. As you can see, technology, we are stumbling into the world of technology. I don't even know, which ringers are on, which sounds are on. And, we've really, sped into this world of virtual instruction out of necessity. It has been a difficult learning curve, even for the tech savviest school districts and universities. What do you think this kind of forced leap has taught us about distance learning, both again in terms of its pros and cons, and how do you see it shaping the future of education, both kind of on a local level, but also internationally?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. I think, you got to look at the glass half full and a lot of times and find the bright spots and silver linings. I've been working in education technology for quite some time now, for a little over a decade now. And prior to making the dive into ed tech, I was the biggest technophobe. So I started off my career, as you mentioned, as a Chicago public schools teacher, and I taught math, and I was the type of person who was like, technology is a distraction. We don't need it. I have my master's degree in mathematics. I understand pedagogy. This is what I'm going to double down on. And I don't want computers in my classroom. I just want my students to sit and do thoughtful mathematics. And then I was voluntold to write a grant.
I like that term.
And I was the low person in the rank. So it's like, oh, someone has to do this. It's going to be Jennie. And I ended up with one-to-one devices in my classroom. And there were a lot of tears, a lot of frustration. And it was a really painful process for me. And I was resisting every step of the way, arguing very loudly that it was disrupting my classroom, that it was creating a decrease in student efficacy and ability and agency. But I had this fear because of my own schema and lived experience of what teaching and learning should look like. From my own education as a young person to my pre-service teaching years to my own education. And at that point, I was teaching at higher ed too. I was teaching master's level students how to become teachers. So everything I knew was my own past experience. What this forced me to do was take a look at these new tools. And what it taught me was if I took a step back and really dug deep into the challenges that I had been facing as an educator my entire career, these tools weren't going to supplant me as a teacher, and they also weren't going to create an unneeded distraction for my students if I double-clicked on the problems that I had and used these tools as innovative ways to approach the same problems. For example, at one point, I was teaching a split grade classroom where I had 2 grade levels of students, and I had to teach 2 years of mathematics education to 40 students in 45 minutes. And that was difficult. I was only one human being. I had, 40 young souls in my room, and I had to teach 2 state level grades of mathematics in that time. What these devices allowed me to do was essentially clone myself. I created small 5-minute bite-sized mini lessons for my students, and I created a differentiated playlist for each child. They came in, they logged on, they got their direct instruction through the device, and then I pulled them in small groups to synthesize and unpack the learning and do some hands-on activities to really dig deep into any misconceptions and misunderstandings. Mm-hmm. I had this whole learning curve that took me, I think, probably 9-10 months to even get to that point. What the pandemic has done is it's fast forwarded that learning curve that I had in my classroom about a decade ago for everyone overnight. So my kicking and screaming and refusal to take out the devices, when people were sent home, they had no choice but to go through that same transition and face that mental block and that fear. And that's the silver lining. Everyone has been forced to confront the fear of what does technology mean in my learning space. The opportunity that we have now is how do we more intentionally and completely support these practitioners and learners and effectively and impactfully using the technology so that it's not distraction, so that it's not creating more stress in the situation, but it is solving problems like it did for me in reaching each of my learners on an individual level. That takes a lot of art and science. It's nuance. It's what we're trying to really work on at Google through partnerships with UNESCO, creating the Teach From Anywhere site, through our Teacher Center, through a lot of our skilled programs. But what we really want to see is how technology can solve age-old problems for educators and help extend teachers, not just during this moment in time where we're digging into distance learning out of necessity, but when we all, as Allan was saying, go back to the classroom, because the pandemic's going to end. We're going to go back to where we were. But I hope that what it does is indelibly change those who are having a mental block of using technology to see how it can be fruitful even when we return to the classroom.
Right. Well, and I think you make such an excellent point of for technophobes, and I can relate because I consider myself one in many respects. Many teachers, feel the same way that you did, and view technology, basic technology as assistance, but beyond that, as you said, you have an ingrained experience and vision of what learning should look like. And that's been coupled with not a gradual transition, but a forced one. And I know even here in Washington, D.C., I know many teachers, we have, again, very, well-off school districts where, the rollout was so incredibly difficult. And so I know, a part of the problem that will need to be addressed is that the introduction to virtual instruction for a lot of students and teachers was a negative one. It was a very difficult one. And so, I'm wondering a follow-up question. As we move forward in the months ahead, how do you think schools should address the concerns of teachers, and what role, how can Google, for instance, help educators and schools who have had this, shock of virtual instruction and are, PTSD now trying to come to grips with it?
Absolutely. I think taking a step back and understanding that what we want to do with technology is not try and replicate exactly what we were doing in the classroom. I think one challenge that a lot of practitioners had is when they moved to a virtual space, they tried to recreate in facsimile the lecture hall, the classroom, the carpet, whatever their learning space was, they wanted it to be identical, but on Google Meet, on whatever video platform they were using. And that's just not possible. It isn't. And so instead, we want to think about what are the limitations of a virtual platform, but what are the opportunities that weren't available when we were face-to-face, when we're seeing our young people in 3D. So for example, I think about discussion sections. So, at the university level, I would have my lecture, and then I would have TAs with my discussion groups that I would have in circles unpack the lecture. And those had to happen synchronously, and a student was in one or the other, and they had their learning group. What we're seeing now is some really creative uses of real-time ability to be in more than one space. So we'll have, the lead practitioner record a lecture, but then we can pause the lecture mid-lecture and have real-time breakouts and discussion groups, and then come back. So instead of sitting in a 60-minute lecture in a discussion hall, right, or a lecture hall, and then 3 days later, going and walking to some classroom and unpacking it, I can chunk that lecture and say, let's take 15 minutes of the content, then let's all get thrown into these breakout spaces where we can unpack that chunk of learning, go back to the main lecture, have some more. And theoretically, that is a pedagogically more sound way to do it, because in that moment of cognitive dissonance, in that moment of learning, I can have somebody who can sit down with me and synthesize the learning in a shared collaborative space. So I think if we support our practitioners in taking a step back and not making it about tech versus 3D, and make it more like, what do you, as the instructor or as the facilitator, want your learners to take away from this space? What are your goals and objectives? And how can we leverage the technology to more impactfully achieve those goals? We're going to see a lot of more satisfied and happy instructors, a lot more satisfied and happy learners, where people feel less frustrated. Instead of badly trying to recreate 3D spaces, create a brand new vision of what teaching and learning might look like using technology as a ingredient in the recipe. Right. And I think to get there, it's a lot of support. It's a lot of time to pause and allow people to get there with support. So again, we have lots of virtual spaces that we created, like the Teach from Anywhere site, like our Teacher Center that's been up even before the pandemic, and we've really helped to augment and make more robust during this moment. And also we recently released a new free program called the Google Certified Coach Program, which helps enable practitioners spaces to lead this transition within your organization.
Right. Well, and I think so many of the points that you mentioned apply to quite a number of industries. I know my own in the media, you tend to get stuck in the way that things have been done for decades. And, for us to transition to the internet, is still an ongoing transition, and it's difficult. Old habits, as you say, die hard. You want to replicate what you've been doing instead of reimagining that this is a whole brand new landscape. So now I want to pose a question to all three of you. Obviously, when it comes to virtual learning, it has cast a harsh light on what many educators are well aware of, which is, of course, the disparities between low-income and high-income students, as well as students of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So as we take stock of the lessons learned, what can we do to, address these systemic inequalities? And Allan, and perhaps we can talk about, what policymakers can do, what institutions themselves can do, and then what role the private sector can play. So, Allan, what are some of your thoughts on what the government can do to begin to address the inequities that have really been revealed by the pandemic?
Maybe the first step is to go to Africa. African schools and African universities have been dealing with pandemics and the inequities that surface when there are pandemics for a long time, and multiple crises. And they're figuring out from the very beginning how you provide the bandwidth, the technology, the coaching to make it possible to deliver remotely things when they have to. And maybe they're more advanced in that experience than we are. They certainly anticipated the cost of data in providing students not only the platform and the device, but the SIM card that allowed them to get data. So I think that there's a lot of lessons from a global pandemic we can learn from other countries. But in America, what's most important is not so much the government, but each university needs to have its own foreign policy and its own preparedness system for the next pandemic and to deal with these inequities, because education is a matter not regulated by the federal government. It's a function of public and private institutions in each state. And I think if we let the pandemic go by and say, well, thank God it's over, we don't have to worry about it again, that will be a mistake. But it's the responsibility of each college and university and school systems to be prepared for dealing with the inequities that we know exist and are not going to go away when we get an injection of a vaccine. And that's really the second pandemic, this pandemic of inequities and structural racism that we have to confront head on.
But now, to follow up on that, but do you see a role for the federal government? Because as we've seen with the pandemic in terms of, restrictions, openings, closings, we have this incredible patchwork of counties and states doing their own thing. And on the one hand, it's good in the sense that you have a tailored approach. But, do you think that there is a role here for the federal government to provide not only guidance, but funds? I mean, expanding the use of laptops requires money, for instance. And obviously we have a new administration coming into power, so what do you think the federal government, what role can they or should they play to help the individual universities?
We should want the federal government to build the 21st century interstate highway system. We did it in the last century. All of us depend on the roads that President Eisenhower discovered the country needed. In the 21st century, we need free internet for all, free bandwidth for all. We need to make sure that not half of our young people can't get to the internet or can't log on or can't afford the data. And building that highway, I think, could be a federal responsibility. It could be a federal project. And maybe it's more important than sending a man back to the moon or a woman back to the moon.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point. So, William, going over to you, what do you think universities can do to address these disparities? And also, if you have any thoughts on policymakers in the private sector as well.
Yeah, let me start with your question about the federal government and pick up on what Allan said. I think partnership is very important. The public-private partnerships. I think no one sector can do it alone. The universities can't do it alone. They have to work effectively with their states, with the local communities, with the federal government. For years now, we've had the Senator Paul Simon bill working its way through Congress, but that would support education abroad for students, particularly when you can look at the inequalities, and you can look at it in our own backyards in terms of even at public universities, the students who are able from lower social economic status families to attend the universities and complete them versus those from higher social economic status categories. How the key role that community colleges play here in helping to fund these community colleges. Again, I think it would have to be a broad partnership, but that we need no one element can provide enough of the funding, enough of the support. So when you look at the social inequality in our backyard, then you just try to expand that to the world. Look at where our international students are coming from. Which international students? Most of them come from families in countries like China, South Korea, India, who can afford the price tag. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's so difficult for us to not only recruit those students, but to be able to make sure they can continue their studies. At West Virginia University, we've had a number of cases of Nigerian students who came to us after, let's say, a year and said, because of the devaluation of our currency, we aren't able to afford the tuition anymore. And so if we had a policy where the private sector, the federal government and the universities could devote more money to students who have the intellectual wherewithal to come to the universities, but don't have these economic wherewithal, that I think this would address the question of inequality in a way we haven't done it so far. So again, it's got to be through all of us working together, the different levels here. And this is particularly a problem at public universities like West Virginia University, where we wish we had more fellowship, scholarship money. But the monies that typically we have, because of certain state policies, will typically go to the in-state students, not to students from overseas.
But of course, and there's always the assumption that students from overseas pay full tuition, which is often the case, which is why they are such a critical demographic. But as you said, if we're going to address inequalities, it cannot just be in your own backyard. So, well, on the issue of partnerships, Jennie, you already touched on some of what Google does. And so what are, same thing, what are some of your thoughts in terms of addressing the disparities in terms of, private, public sector partnerships? And, and also what did you see in your own experiences as a teacher in Chicago public schools? I mean, I think that offers such a unique vantage point as well.
I think there's so much to say here. I think there's one of the roles that I had the privilege of was sitting on the technical working group for the 2016 reauthorization of the National Education Technology Plan. Mm-hmm. So working with the U.S. Department of Education to write that document and to think about what are the messages that were important from a federal level to share out. And one of the big things that I'm really excited came out in that document was really unpacking the digital divide and thinking about the layers and the nuance of it. So we're so familiar with the digital access divide that most folks really dig deeply into. So the access to devices, to internet is mentioned. And I love the analogy of the internet and highways and making it a commodity that everyone should have access to. So that's a very needed disparity to address. The other one that I think is a bit less known and can be really, really harmful as well is the digital use divide. So we see in the K-12 space a lot of institutions using Title I funding for students who are marginalized and at lower socioeconomic levels, getting one-to-one devices. But the use of those devices are at a much lower pedagogical level than we might see at more affluent institutions. And that there's so many reasons for that. There is the lack of professional learning support for the practitioners. There is a need and a dedication to be tied more towards test scores and the inability to innovate and take more time to be experimental because of this kind of pants on fire need to say, like, we need to stick to these one or two things because kids are so behind. At the university level, we're seeing similar things in private and public institutions in terms of the ability and funding to innovate and to try different things. And so what we want to make sure is when technology is brought into the classroom, that we're not like, okay, it's done. Equity, check, nailed it. We have internet, we have one-to-one devices, everyone's good. But there's another step to go in addressing that digital use divide of, are we supporting the young people and the practitioners in impactfully leveraging these tools to make better opportunities for teaching and learning? And that, that's the kind of through line of what I've been sharing in this panel. But I really hope folks, if they take anything away from things that I share, is it's not enough just to have the tech, it's how you use it. And the analogy that I always say is you can give a 16-year-old keys to your Maserati, and they'll be really excited to have a fancy, powerful new car. But if they don't have a driver's license and don't have a lot of time behind the wheel supporting and guidance and using it well, at best, they're not going to get the full use out of that super souped up vehicle. At worst, it could be very dangerous. So we want to make sure folks know how to use these powerful tools with responsibility.
Yeah. I barely managed to beat up Mitsubishi when I went to college, so I can't imagine a Maserati. But no, that's such an excellent point, because here in Washington D.C. and covering what's been happening to schools, we have transitioned where most students now have laptops. So it's really not a question of, they've received Chromebooks. They have, as you said, the tools, but we're still seeing grades plummeting. So as you said, it's not just having the tool in front of you, but knowing how to use it. So I want to, while we have time, I want to switch gears to another important subject. And I'm sorry, you're going to hear a lawnmower in the background. The joys of technology and remote talking. But, obviously, even before the pandemic, the big issue in education, and it, of course, will be in the months ahead in the Biden administration, is immigration and the tightened immigration policies that have been enacted over the last 4 years under the Trump administration. And some of these policies have been announced, have not come to fruition, but they have also, kind of added to this perception that foreign students are not welcome in the U.S. And we're starting to see, I know IIE really does an excellent job of tracking the figures, and we're starting to see the dips and the results of what's been happening over the last 4 years. So, Allan, can you kind of give us a big picture view of how the Trump administration's immigration policies have affected international students coming to the U.S.?
Ask me that in another year, because it's going to take another year to see what sticks, what remains, what doesn't. I think the good news for all of us is that we still have had 1 million international students coming to the United States. We have plenty of room for those students. We have plenty of capacity compared to many other countries. And one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that not only us, but a lot of other countries had to figure out that they will accept for credit more than one online course as part of a degree program for a student to be valid in their visa status. We hadn't thought very much about that because we were used to the old paradigm in person. So there have been some silver linings to this, even in the visa area. And Jennie's remarks point up something really important for William and me for the future. You're going to give us a cohort of pandemic-proven high school students now coming to our public and private colleges and universities with at least a year of experience at remote and hybrid education. Might be longer. But how do we get ready for those high school students to become college freshmen? What qualities of the learning and on-campus experience do we want to highlight that they didn't have? What did they miss in socialization because they were remote from their teachers, their classroom, and their peers for perhaps a year, perhaps 18 months? And I think we haven't yet begun to think about what that means when we can open our doors and resume, but we won't resume as normal. And these students won't be normal. And we need to be as prepared for them as we be even more prepared for them as we would for freshmen. So I think a year from now, we will know a lot more about what this experience has meant for American higher education, for international education, and the fundamental nature of American society and welcoming international students. I think will quickly resume and be stronger than ever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so William, going over to you. I mean, what are your thoughts on immigration policies, and what have you seen at your university?
Yeah. From where I'm positioned, I'm not as optimistic as my good friend Allan. We have benefited over so many decades from the flow of top-notch international students. I mean, we know in terms of the number of patents that have been given to individuals, the disproportionate numbers of recent immigrants or international students who are responsible for those. But as I look into my crystal ball, there are just so many dark clouds there. I mean, as you mentioned, and as Allan has shown, over the last 4 years, the number of international student enrollments have dipped. But when you look out there, you've got to look at what I call some of these dark clouds. And for example, the cost. When you sample, and I know the State Department, ECA has been involved in this. When you sample families and students from overseas, what's the major obstacle to attending an American university? The cost of American universities is always the number one factor. When you compare that to now, very high quality universities in Southeast Asia emerging. China is has highly ranked universities. You have New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Great Britain. There's a lot more competition in much of continental Europe. They've moved over to an English language curriculum. So when you look at the cost and you look at the competition, you have to start saying, well, is it inevitable that our international student numbers will reach levels they've had in pre-pandemic? Then you look at is America as welcoming? We can't kid ourselves. Before the pandemic, when I traveled overseas, people said, well, I hear about the high crime rate in the United States. I hear in terms of the emergence of really strong nativism, anti-foreigner sentiment. And I think this has hurt us. I look at our reduced budgets. Now, one thing that needs to be said is that for us to be effective in recruiting international students, we need to be able to have an office. We need to be able to have people, whether it's connecting with them through virtual platforms or even traveling overseas. Universities are making tough decisions now, and budgets for international offices to carry out this work, to play a key role in recruitment, they have been slashed. And then you look at certain federal policies, and I'm optimistic that the Biden administration will take a different approach to visa policies, to OPT, to help opening the doors and a different welcoming for international students. But when you look at this and you look at the fact that the pandemic, even when the vaccines are shown to be, they have been shown to be effective, but even when we reach a level where people can go out and not worry about so much the social distancing, I think many people in particularly major source regions of the world for us, for international students, are going to say, well, there are fine universities in Malaysia, in Singapore, in China. Do I need to send my child all the way across the Pacific or the Atlantic? So I think because I think the pandemic has shown people to force them to maybe say, should I look closer to home? So when you add up these factors, I'm thinking unless we really start yesterday in thinking creatively and innovatively about what types of education programs we can offer to international students, and I'm a big proponent of dual degrees, of having the students take part of their education at their home university and then using virtual platforms for part of that, and then spending time at the American university or the foreign university as part of the degree to save costs, because getting an American degree by just sitting in a classroom in a foreign country for 4 years doesn't do it, because there's much more to learning about America and American education than just sitting in a classroom. You got to get out in the community, you got to meet people, you got to be part of that diverse environment. So I think there are ways that we can address what I see in the future to be a decline in international students, but we have to be entrepreneurial, creative, and we have to do it now.
And of course, and as you mentioned, and not only schools in many parts of the world that are expanding, but you also have countries such as Canada and Australia who are promoting themselves and taking advantage of what many foreigners perceive as an anti-immigrant climate here in the U.S. So, Jennie, obviously, Google and tech companies are very inextricably linked to this debate over visas for foreign workers, but also by extension foreign students. So obviously, what are some of your thoughts on the immigration policies of the last 4 years, and how do you respond to concerns that that a lot of these visas are maybe bringing in critical STEM workers, but they are crowding out Americans in the process?
Well, I guess from my perspective, I can't speak on behalf of Google. I don't work in HR, the people ops, the hiring side, so I can't really say what Google's perspective is. I can say that just personally, I really love working at Google because of the diversity and the richness of the perspectives and the individuals with whom I work. And I think that there's a lot to be said with having a diversity of experience and mindsets to get, really creative solutions to things. At a company level, I can't really say, not because I know and I'm not allowed to say, I actually don't know what the policy is. But I can say that I think, when I first started my education career, I worked for a program called the Royal Thai Scholar Program. And so I worked at a boarding school in New Hampshire called Brustein Academy. And Thai scholars who were high school seniors in Thailand and won this award through the national exam would come to the United States to go to university up through the higher ed degree for 4 to 8 years. And my program was a summer bridge program for these high school students to be immersed in American culture. As I heard my other panelists say, there's so much more to it, right? To understand the United States and the culture. And it was so eye-opening for me as a practitioner who was used to working with US students and US high schoolers to now work with these scholars coming from Thailand who had worked for some of them their entire lives to win this prestigious honor to come over. And I would ask them, why are you here? Like, why do you want to come to the United States and learn all summer? Like, you could be doing something else during summer break, but instead you're here in New Hampshire at, Lake Winnipesaukee, learning about American slang and food. And we did Halloween with them and taught them cultures and rituals. And they said, America is so exciting because it's the place everyone comes to. And the thing that was really unique about it was because United States is a magnet for so many reasons in terms of the quality of our higher ed institutions, because of our industry. The other maybe unspoken benefit is that richness and the texture of who you're going to meet when you come to America, that it is a world exchange. And I understand that, you named some spaces of like, maybe there's some difference of opinion and reputation out there now, but still coming to the United States and in my other world travels, the uniqueness of who you're going to run into and who you're going to have a conversation with in our universities and our institutions of higher ed, that diversity is a learning experience in and of itself, that I could be sitting to my left, a Royal Thai scholar, and to my right, someone who grew up in a single stoplight town in, Central Florida. And to have that conversation and that meeting of the minds is a really beautiful thing that I think we should celebrate.
Well, I want to conclude kind of a big question, a twofold general question and a very specific question for all of you. When you think of the future of education, what gets you excited in general? And if something in particular gets you very scared, talk about that as well. And are there, we talked a lot about innovation, so maybe Jennie, this is more of a question that will be specifically for you of, are there any particular technologies and innovations that you are excited, that are coming online in the near future? So, just your general thoughts on when I say future of education, what pops into your head, Allan?
The same thing that excites me is the same thing that scares me. It's the answer to the question of will we have a reformation? We've had the great disruption. It's caused by many things. We know what the problems are, as William has identified them clearly, from a hybrid to equality to cost to immigration issues. We will change. This period will change us. And the question for us is, will higher education have its own reformation? Will it change fast enough? Will it be ready for the future? And I think it will.
All right, great. And William, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, it's the universities are learning now that programs that they have, initiatives, really must be mission central, must add value to different constituencies. And that, take the example of education abroad. I see fewer and fewer programs that are just like study tourism. And I see more in education abroad experience embedded into the curriculum, embedded into faculty teaching, but also ones that address the needs of students as well as their wishes in terms of internships, international service learning. The downside to this type of more critical, missions critical and value added aspect is that universities are going to be forced to cut certain disciplines that they see aren't the revenue generating ones, that the public may not see as enabling students to graduate and get jobs immediately that are high paying. And that will be a true disservice to all of us when you start cutting, in particularly the arts, the humanities, because as we know, to truly be a global citizen, and you listen to people in the private sector who do the hiring, they like the English major, they like the philosophy majors, they like people who can bring critical and creative thinking and teamwork to the workspace. And so I worry about the cuts that universities may make as they think more about being mission.
Well, Jennie, also over to you for your thoughts. And we've received a few questions also in terms of, obviously, international exchange and study abroad programs themselves are important. But do you think there are any ways to formalize these kind of programs of distance learning, of, you know, the virtual landscape, so that moving forward, we increase, you know, collaborations among U.S. entities, all kinds of educational entities and international institutions, with all of kind of this virtual learning, learning about virtual learning that we've done. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think some things that get me really excited is we talked about throwing folks into the deep end with tech, right? And because of this massive adoption of technology, the other maybe unforeseen benefit and consequence, depending on which way you're looking at it, is now that folks are more aware of the power that technology can have to solve problems in institutions of learning, they're putting in more orders and feature requests to solve problems that they didn't realize could be solved by tech. So before, because no one was looking in that direction, you know, it was like, oh, you know, some people were like, hey, can you build this thing because we need X, Y, Z, quack, quack, quack. Now that the entire world is looking at education and technology and the confluence of the two spaces, we're getting, you know, the feature requests at Google, it's just like lighting up all day. Like, can you build this? Can you do this? Can you do that? And that is so exciting because we're getting problems thrown at us that we hadn't thought of before. So the ability to innovate in new spaces is really, really thrilling. And I can't wait for where our roadmap heads as we have more voices speaking to problems that we can solve in education. In terms of formalizing distance learning and like kind of making the world feel smaller through technology, this is not a new thing, right? I mean, my colleagues on the panel here and others, I'm sure, are familiar with massive open online courses, which have been around for decades. And they were kind of like that first foray into distance learning where I could log in. Again, like I grew up in Central Florida, like I could log in from north of Orlando and have never left my 20-mile radius, but have another student in my discussion section from, you know, Seoul, Korea. And it's the first Korean from Korea I might have ever met. And that's huge for me culturally to have grown up as the only person who looks like me in this, you know, Central Floridian town. And then to all of a sudden be speaking to someone from downtown Seoul on a daily basis about a subject of content that interests me. And I might never have the funding and access to go do a study abroad in Korea, but I now have access to some of the culture and someone from that space. So MOOCs have been around for a long time, and I think we're seeing the extension of that concept in not as massive open online courses, but maybe smaller closed online courses. But that concept has been around. I think the biggest bridge that we have to figure out is time. And that's something I work on a global team. You know, my title is Global Head of Education Impact, which means like I'm trying to figure out a way to meet with someone from Sydney, Australia, London in the UK, Colombia and San Francisco at one time. How do we find spaces and times where folks are? And the thing though that I think is beautiful about that I heard both William and Allan name is as we get this new generation of folks who are going into higher ed, how does higher ed evolve to that space? And I think breaking some of our mindsets of like a 9-to-5 mentality that like my life begins at this time in the morning with the sun and closes. But as I become a global citizen, maybe I take some of the middle of the day for wellness and I go for a run and I take a nap and I spend time with my family. But then maybe I log on in the evening so I can have this really rich conversation with someone from the other side of the planet. And right now that's really hard schema for folks to break because we were used to this like kind of 9-to-5 mentality since we were young people. But as folks go into universities, maybe as we have these global spaces, it could begin retraining people to get into the future of work as well.
Right. And certainly it's retraining all of us adults as well. I mean, we started remote working, but it's you know, transforming all of our lives. And I really appreciate that everyone has brought up some of the silver linings to this, because it's difficult to see when you are in the midst of these headlines and what is happening, especially in the next critical months to come. So I really appreciate those insights. And for some of the people who had asked about formalizing, for instance, programs, we will also have tomorrow a panel on building education institutions overseas with Santana and Arizona State University that will talk about specifically how they have formed a lot of these digital partnerships with universities in all kinds of countries. And William, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka, countries where they are beginning to really establish their higher education system and beginning to look for partnerships with universities, U.S. universities. So we will be addressing all of these topics tomorrow as well, and later, continuing through the day. Up next, we have your colleague, Allan Martel, who she will give us kind of an overview of what we do know for now of how COVID-19 has impacted international exchange, with some insights into, how colleges and universities have responded so far. So I think it's going to be a lot of interesting statistics that a lot of people haven't really gathered yet. So that is coming up next. After that, we're going to have a very important discussion on mental health and reopening and, closing schools, the impact that is having on young people. And we're going to have two guests who have direct experience of this dilemma of reopening, how they have gone about reopening schools in a safe, phased manner, and how in the process they are addressing the emotional issues that come from virtual learning, because of course it's not just educational, it's emotional for many people as well. So we have a lot to come. And speaking of the joys of technology, we are going to take a networking break for about 10-15 minutes. For audience members, what you can do is you can click on your left-hand side networking. And I think that what is great about this platform, Hopin, is it kind of replicates the breaks you would have in an in-person conference. And as soon as you click, you just click a button to get started, and it will automatically randomly pair you with another participant. And it's kind of like speed networking. You'll get a chance to chit chat for 3 minutes, introduce yourself. And if you want to, you can continue, and kind of a nice way to just mingle with the folks that have tuned in here. And another option, if you'd like, is below the networking button, you have an expo button. That's going to take you to several expo booths of our sponsors, including Cigna, Georgetown University, Merit Academy, Sahori Insurance. And there you can directly go in and talk with the speakers there from the organizations. If you have any questions, you can get more information. So it's kind of a nice way to be in touch as close as we can in this virtual environment. And, as we know, conferences are also a bit about all about networking. So this platform gives you that opportunity. So I encourage you to take advantage of that, and then stay tuned. We will have our next panel in about 15 minutes. So thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Great to see everybody.
Studying or teaching abroad can be an exciting opportunity. It can also come with a lot of uncertainties when it comes to accessing care. Cigna StudyWell from Cigna Global Health Benefits was designed specifically with your globally mobile students and faculty in mind. They'll have access to the largest global network of healthcare providers, with a wide array of 24/7 support resources. So they'll have peace of mind, knowing that when they're away from home, they're not far from care. To learn more about Cigna StudyWell plan options, contact your Cigna representative.